She cried when the rancher pulled the iron arrow from her chest until she realized he was bleeding. The wind howled through the desolate desert, its cold fingers sweeping across the barren land. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, rolling in fast as if the heavens themselves were preparing for a storm. The ground, cracked and parched from weeks of no rain, trembled with the approaching forces of nature. Among the relentless gusts, the distant rumble of thunder could be heard, warning of the fury that was about to unfold. In the midst of this chaotic weather, a lone figure stumbled across the desert. She was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes that barely protected her from the harsh winds. Her steps were unsteady, each one bringing her closer to the edge of collapse. By sweat mixed with the dust on her forehead, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. Blood stained her hands and dripped from her chest, where an iron arrow was lodged deep, a cruel weapon that had nearly ended her life. She had been running, though she couldn't remember for how long. All she knew was that she had to escape. But the pain in her chest, the blinding agony, was slowing her down. Her vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt and spin. Every step felt like an eternity, and yet she kept moving forward. There was no other choice. She couldn't stop. The storm began to intensify, and the wind howled louder, threatening to tear her apart. Her legs trembled beneath her, and her body felt as if it were breaking into pieces. Pain from the arrow, now more than just a wound, seemed to pulse through her body with every movement. But still she pressed on, determined to make it, to find shelter, to find safety. Just when she thought she couldn't go on any longer, her foot caught on something, rock, dirt, or maybe the dry bones of the earth, and she fell hard to the ground. Her face hit the dirt, and her body went limp. The woman didn't know how long she lay there, but when she finally opened her eyes, the storm had only worsened. The sky had turned dark as night, and rain began to fall in torrents. She could feel the wetness soaking her clothes, the cold water seeping into her skin. But what caught her attention wasn't the storm. It was something else. She saw a shape in the distance, barely visible through the pouring rain. A cabin. A tiny cabin nestled against the edge of a small hill, just barely visible through the storm. The woman's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't have been more than a few hundred yards away from it. But she had no strength left. She was cold, exhausted, and bleeding. She couldn't make it that far. She would die here, in the middle of nowhere, with no one to help her. But the thought of death was too much to bear. She had survived this long, hadn't she, Burrow? The thought of dying out here, alone, was unbearable. She had to try. She had to reach that cabin. With what little strength she had left, the woman pushed herself up from the ground. The arrow in her chest flared with pain, but she ignored it. She forced herself to move, stumbling forward, each step feeling like a battle against her own body. The cabin seemed to grow further away as she moved, but she pushed on, not letting herself stop. The storm raged harder. The wind tore at her clothes and whipped her face with icy fingers. She couldn't see clearly anymore, but she refused to stop. She wasn't going to die out here. The last stretch of ground was a blur. Her legs buckled beneath her and she fell to her knees. She had no energy left to rise, but somehow she found the strength to crawl forward. She dragged herself across the dirt, her hands scraping against the earth, her body aching with every inch she moved. It seemed like an eternity, but eventually she reached the door.
She reached out, her fingers trembling, and knocked weakly against the wood. She barely had the strength to lift her head, but she heard a voice, muffled from inside.
"Who is it?" The voice was gruff and deep, and for a moment the woman thought she might have imagined it. But no.
It was real. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come.
Narration. All she could manage was a soft, desperate whisper. "Help." Then the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light inside. He was tall, dressed in the worn clothes of a rancher, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He looked down at her, his face unreadable, protectingness. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain fell heavily around them, the storm's fury amplified by the silence. The man seemed to hesitate. Then his expression softened. His eyes flicked to her chest, where the arrow was buried deep, the blood still dripping from the wound. Without a word, he moved quickly to her side, kneeling down. His strong hands gripped her arms gently but firmly, lifting her up into his arms, as if she weighed nothing. He moved quickly, carrying her inside the cabin and placed her carefully on a worn wooden bed near the hearth. The woman was too weak to speak or even move, her body trembling with cold and pain. The rancher moved with quiet urgency. He went to a small shelf near the fire and grabbed a few supplies. He was calm, focused. He had seen injuries before. But this one was bad. The arrow had pierced her deeply. It was a miracle she was still alive. He turned to her, his expression softening. "I'll get this out of you," he muttered. The woman's eyes fluttered open briefly, and she tried to speak, but all that came out was a soft groan of pain. She could see the rancher's face, though it was blurred. His strong hands were steady as he worked, trying to assess her injury. "Don't worry," he said, his voice reassuring. "I've handled worse than this." But the woman's thoughts were a jumble. She couldn't understand how she had made it this far. Who was this man? Why was he helping her? Bah. The rancher placed a hand gently on her shoulder and nodded. "You're safe now. Desk. You're going to be all right?" But inside, he wasn't sure. He had seen death in many forms, but there was something about this woman, something about the way she had come to him, that unsettled him. He had never seen someone so determined to survive. It was as if something deep inside her had refused to give up. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only thing that would keep her alive. He moved to her side, lifting the arrow from her chest, trying to keep the woman as still as possible. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin there was nothing but the sound of rain and the soft, steady rhythm of the rancher's hands working to save her life. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering flames of a small fire in the hearth. The rain outside pounded against the cabin's roof like a steady drum, and the wind howled in the distance. Inside it was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft breaths of the woman lying on the bed. The rancher, having placed her gently on the bed, stepped back to assess her. He could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. The arrow had been lodged deep in her chest, and the blood loss was concerning. He'd seen injuries before, but this was different. The woman was fighting to stay conscious, but it was clear that the pain was too much for her. Best. He had no time to waste. He had to work quickly. He turned toward a small table near the corner of the room where he kept some basic supplies, bandages, antiseptic, and a few old tools that had been passed down to him by his father. As he gathered what he needed, his thoughts wandered. Who was this woman? Why was she out here alone, in the middle of nowhere, wounded and alone? He hadn't asked her name yet, hadn't even heard her speak much beyond her desperate plea for help when she first arrived. His mind raced with questions, but there was no time for them. The woman's life was in his hands, and that was all that mattered now. He returned to her side and sat down on the edge of the bed. He looked at her carefully. She was pale, her skin clammy and cold to the touch. Her breathing was shallow, and her face was twisted in pain. Her clothes, soaked through with rain and blood, clung to her body. Brr. Her hair, wet and tangled, hung around her face in wild strands. She looked fragile, as if the wind itself could carry her away. She hadn't spoken since she'd been brought inside, but her eyes fluttered open every now and then, locking onto the rancher's face as if she was trying to understand what was happening. His heart went out to her, but he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. He had a job to do. "Stay with me," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him.
"You've made it this far. You can make it through this."
Carefully, he reached for the arrow that was still embedded in her chest. It was a cruel weapon, its iron tip gleaming ominously in the firelight.
His hand trembled for just a moment, but he steadied himself. The wound was deep, but he knew if he didn't remove the arrow soon, the woman would bleed out. Great. He positioned himself behind her, gently lifting her shoulders so that he could get a better angle. His fingers brushed against her skin, and he felt a strange warmth, despite the coldness of her body. The woman's eyes fluttered open again, and she looked up at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, though it didn't feel as confident as he wanted it to. "I'm going to help you," he said quietly, his voice steady. "You're going to be all right." She nodded faintly, her lips moving as if to speak, but no words came out. Her head lolled back against the pillow, and she closed her eyes once more. The rancher took that as a sign to act quickly. With a firm grip, he pulled the arrow free from her chest. The woman's body jerked, and she let out a strangled gasp, but the rancher held her steady, his hands firm but gentle. Blood poured from the wound, and he quickly pressed a cloth to it, trying to stop the flow. His heart pounded in his chest as he worked, every moment feeling like an eternity. When the bleeding began to slow, he carefully removed the cloth, replacing it with a clean bandage. He wrapped it tightly around her chest, trying to hold the wound together, but it wasn't perfect. It wasn't good enough. He needed to do more. Her breathing was still shallow, and her pulse was weak. Psst. She wasn't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. He knew he had to get her out of here, to a doctor, or to some kind of help. But the storm outside was relentless, and the nearest town was days away by horseback. It would be impossible to get there in time. He stood up, pacing the small cabin as he tried to think. What could he do? He needed to keep her warm, to keep her alive. The fire was good, but it wasn't enough. Desperation. She needed more. He glanced back at the bed, his eyes lingering on her pale face. She was so still, her body limp with exhaustion and pain. The rancher felt a pang of guilt. He had never been good at this, at taking care of others. His whole life had been about surviving, about looking out for himself. But this woman was different. She wasn't some stranger passing through. No, there was something about her, something that made him feel responsible for her well-being.
A noise broke him from his thoughts.
The woman shifted slightly, her hand moving weakly toward her chest. Inspiration. She opened her eyes, and this time she managed to speak, her voice hoarse. "Who are you?" she whispered, her eyes filled with confusion and pain. The rancher's heart skipped a beat. He had been so focused on keeping her alive he hadn't even thought to introduce himself. "I'm just a rancher," he said, his voice calm. "I live out here alone."
"I found you outside. You were hurt."
She nodded slowly, her hand trembling as she touched the bandage on her chest. "Thank you for helping me."
The words were simple, but they meant more than she could possibly know.
The rancher sat back down next to her, watching her carefully. "No need to thank me," he said softly. "I just did what needed to be done." She gave him a faint smile, but it was quickly replaced by a wince of pain. Her body was still recovering from the trauma, and the fever was starting to set in. He could feel the heat radiating from her, and he knew that it wasn't a good sign. The rancher was out of his depth. He had no training in medicine, no knowledge of what to do next. All he could do was wait and pray that she was strong enough to survive. As the night stretched on, the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. The wind continued to howl and the rain beat against the walls of the cabin. But inside, the rancher stayed at her side, watching over her. Hours passed, and the woman's condition remained the same, weak, feverish, but alive. Her breathing was slower now, more even. It seemed like she had finally succumbed to sleep, and the rancher allowed himself a moment to breathe. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for now all he could do was stay with her, keep her warm, and hope that help would come. As the fire crackled softly in the background, the rancher sat quietly beside her, thinking about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if she would make it through the night. But for now, he would do everything in his power to keep her safe. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin there was a quiet calm, a fragile peace that hung in the air. The rancher was no longer just a man living alone in the desert. He was a man with a purpose, with someone to protect, and that made all the difference. The night stretched on, its darkness deepened by the heavy storm outside. Inside the cabin, the flickering light from the fire cast shadows against the walls, creating an eerie stillness. The rancher sat by the bed, his eyes never leaving the woman as she slept. The steady rise and fall of her chest was a small comfort, but he could see the faint flush of fever on her cheeks, the tremble in her hands when she stirred. He knew she was still fighting. But how long could she hold on? His thoughts wandered as he stared into the fire, the warmth of the flames doing little to ease the cold worry gnawing at him. The storm raged outside, the wind howling louder, as if it were a warning. The rancher didn't know how much longer he could stay in this small cabin, alone with a woman whose life was hanging by a thread. His father had taught him many things over the years: how to ride, how to survive, how to fix fences and mend wounds in cattle. But he had never learned how to deal with human injuries. When it came to animals, he knew what to do. But this woman was different. He had no idea if she would survive the night. She had bled too much, and the arrow wound was deep. Her fever was rising, and there was no way of knowing what kind of infection had set in. A soft groan broke the silence. The rancher's head snapped up, and he saw that the woman's eyes were fluttering open. Bray. Her face was pale, her lips dry, but there was a slight tremor in her hand as she reached for the bandages around her chest. Her fingers brushed against a cloth as if to reassure herself that she was still alive. She managed to sit up slightly, her body clearly struggling with the effort. Her eyes met his, and there was a flicker of recognition in them. But she still looked disoriented, confused. The rancher could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the fear that hadn't left since she had first arrived. "Don't try to move too much," he said gently, his voice calm and steady. "You need to rest." She didn't respond right away, but her gaze softened. She swallowed, and the rancher could see the pain on her face as she tried to speak. "Where am I?" Her voice was weak, cracked from dehydration.
Who are you? His heart skipped a beat at the question.
He had been so focused on helping her that he hadn't even thought to introduce himself. I'm just a rancher," he said, his words coming out slow as he tried to keep his emotions in check. "I found you outside. You were hurt." "Ah! Brought you in," The woman's gaze shifted to the fire, her eyes distant as if trying to process everything. The rancher could see the weight of the situation pressing down on her, and he knew it wasn't just the injury that was troubling her. There was something deeper, something that had brought her out here alone. But for now, the rancher didn't ask. She needed rest more than anything.
I don't know what happened, she murmured, her hand still hovering over the wound on her chest.
I can't remember. She broke off, her voice faltering. She tried to sit up further, but the pain seemed to seize her and she winced, her face contorting. The rancher immediately moved to support her, gently easing her back down. You need to lie still, he said firmly. Break, you've lost a lot of blood. You won't get better if you keep moving. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, and for a second, the rancher thought she might fall asleep again. But she opened them, and there was a look of determination in her gaze, a hint of something that told him she wasn't going to give up so easily. Why did you help me? She asked, her voice quieter now. Why didn't you just leave me out there? The rancher hesitated. It was a question he hadn't expected, and he wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was, he didn't know why he had helped her. It wasn't like him to get involved with strangers. Thus, he had learned long ago that it was easier to stay to himself, to keep his distance. But something had drawn him to her that day. Something in the way she had looked at him, desperate and broken. I couldn't just leave you out there, he said simply, his voice steady but laced with something deeper. You needed help. And I couldn't ignore that. Her eyes softened, and she gave him a faint, grateful smile. But it was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She wasn't used to receiving help, he could tell. I don't even know your name, she whispered. He paused, feeling a strange sense of vulnerability. It's Jack. Jack Wyatt. Break.
The woman nodded slowly, as if she were committing the name to memory. Jack. She seemed to test the name on her tongue, like it held some kind of comfort, something familiar in the midst of the confusion.
For a moment the rancher was quiet. He couldn't help but wonder about her. Who was she? How had she ended up alone in the desert with a wound like that? But there was no time to ask questions. She was still struggling, and he had to focus on getting her through this. How are you feeling? He asked, changing the subject.
The pain. Is it worse?
She closed her eyes again, as if weighing the truth of the question. Narration. It's bad, she admitted softly. But I felt worse. I don't know if I can make it, though. The rancher's heart clenched at her words. He could hear the fear in her voice, and it made something inside him stir, something protective, something fierce.
You're stronger than you think, he said, his voice firm but encouraging.
You're still here. That's something. She didn't respond right away, and for a long moment, it seemed like she might fall back to sleep. The rancher watched her closely, his mind still racing. How long could she survive like this? He had to think of a way to get her the help she needed. He had to find a solution, even if it meant risking everything to do it. He stood up from the bed and walked over to the window. The storm outside was just as fierce as before, the rain pelting the glass with a loud rhythmic noise. He could barely see through the haze, the darkness outside swallowing everything.
It wasn't safe to travel through a storm like this.
The woman needed rest, not another journey, but something inside him told him that there was no time to wait. She needed help, and he had to find a way to get it to her. He returned to her side and sat down again, watching her carefully. Her breathing had slowed, but she still looked pale, fragile.
I'm going to do my best to keep you safe, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Just rest. I'll figure this out. We'll make it through. The woman nodded weakly, her eyes closing as she gave in to the exhaustion. Her hand rested gently on the bandages around her chest, the only sign that she was still aware of her surroundings. The rancher stayed by her side, his thoughts consumed with finding a solution, finding help. But in that moment, as the storm raged outside, all he could do was sit in the quiet, watching over her, hoping that his efforts would be enough to save her. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up. The wind howled, the rain battered the cabin, and the sky seemed to be one endless sheet of gray. Inside, the warmth of the fire flickered in contrast to the cold that still lingered in the cabin, but the rancher felt none of it. His focus was entirely on the woman in front of him. She had drifted in and out of consciousness for hours, and he could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier with every passing moment. Her fever was still rising, and he could see that her body was struggling to stay strong. The rancher had done what he could with the limited supplies in his cabin. But now, as the night stretched on, he knew that it wasn't enough. The wound on her chest needed more care than he could provide. The fever in her body was too strong, and the infection that could be setting in was something he couldn't fight off on his own.
He stood by her side, looking down at her as she slept fitfully.
The bandage was soaked with blood again, and he replaced it gently with a fresh one, trying his best not to disturb her. But every time he changed the dressing, her body trembled. The rancher could feel her pain, even if she wasn't awake enough to acknowledge it. A soft cough broke the silence, and he glanced down to see her eyes fluttering open. She was clearly disoriented, her gaze unfocused as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. "Jack!" she whispered, her voice faint, but she said his name with a sense of recognition that caused a small smile to form on his lips. He couldn't help it. Despite the grim situation, he was relieved to see her awake, even for a moment. "I'm here," he said, his voice calm and steady. "How are you feeling?" She blinked a few times, trying to focus, and then winced as she moved slightly, her hand instinctively touching the bandage over her wound.
"It still hurts," she said quietly, her voice thick with exhaustion. "But
I'm still here." Her words were weak, but the rancher could hear the effort she was putting into them, and something in his chest tightened.
There was strength in her, a will to survive that was undeniable. But the fear in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on.
"You're a fighter," he said softly, trying to encourage her.
You've made it this far. You'll make it through. The woman gave him a weak, almost imperceptible nod, but her face twisted with discomfort.
"Ben, I don't know if I can. I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered, her eyes closing briefly as she struggled to breathe through the pain. The rancher's heart sank.
She was right. No matter how much willpower she had, her body was losing the battle. He could feel it in the way she was breathing, the way her skin felt burning hot to the touch. If they didn't do something soon, she wouldn't make it.
"We can't just stay here," he muttered to himself. He knew he had to act, even if the storm outside made it impossible to reach help in time.
He couldn't let her die out here. He couldn't let this be the end of her story. He stood up, pacing around the small cabin. His mind raced. There had to be something he could do. He couldn't let the storm keep him from saving her. Breaths. He had no medical training, but he had to try. There were herbs in the nearby forest that his father had taught him to recognize. Plants that could help with infections. Plants that could ease the pain. If he could get to them, maybe he could keep her stable long enough for the fever to break. His eyes darted back to her, and for a moment he felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. He couldn't leave her alone, not when she was in this state. But if he stayed, If he didn't get help, she might not make it through the night. The thought terrified him. "I'll be back," he said, his voice firm, but he didn't wait for her response. He grabbed his coat from the corner and hurried to the door. The storm outside was fierce, the wind so strong it almost slammed the door shut behind him. But he had no choice. Best, he had to go. As he stepped outside into the wet night, the rain poured down harder than ever. The wind pushed against him, howling through the trees and making every step difficult. The rancher gritted his teeth and pressed on, the mud beneath his boots making it harder to keep his balance, but he couldn't afford to stop. He had to find what he needed. The forest wasn't far from the cabin, but the rain made it difficult to see, the trees bending under the weight of the storm. He pushed through the underbrush, his breath coming out in sharp gasps as the cold and the wind worked against him. He had no way of knowing how much time he had left before the woman's condition worsened, but every minute felt like a lifetime. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he reached the small clearing where the herbs grew. His father had taught him where to find them, but tonight, in the middle of the storm, everything seemed different. The forest felt like a maze, the shadows of the trees stretching out like dark fingers, reaching for him. But the rancher ignored the unease building in his chest and got to work. He quickly gathered the herbs, his hands shaking from both the cold and the urgency of the situation. He knew the plants he was looking for, some for infection, some to ease pain, and others to help her body fight off the fever. He didn't waste time looking for more. He took only what he needed and hurried back toward the cabin, the wind still howling around him. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment, his hand on the handle, listening for any sound coming from inside. The silence that grated him made his stomach turn and his heart beat faster as he pushed the door open. Inside, the fire had dimmed slightly, but it still offered a weak glow. The woman was still lying on the bed, but she had shifted slightly, her face drawn with pain. She was barely conscious, her breaths shallow and uneven. The rancher rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see that her condition had worsened while he was gone. Grasp. He didn't have much time. Without wasting another moment, he began working quickly, grinding the herbs and mixing them with some water from his canteen. He would need to make a poultice, and then he would have to hope it worked. He sat beside her, gently lifting her head and helping her sip the mixture, but then her hand moved weakly to his, holding on as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. "Drink," he said softly, urging her to take what he had prepared. "It'll help, I promise." She swallowed weakly, the look in her eyes both grateful and weary. Her hand slipped from his, and she closed her eyes again. The rancher stayed by her side, his fingers brushing against her hand, trying to offer whatever comfort he could. As the hours stretched on, the storm outside began to ease. The rain slowed and the wind calmed, though the sky remained dark.
Inside the cabin, the rancher continued to tend to her, reapplying the poultice and checking her temperature.
It felt like time had slowed to a crawl, every minute dragging by as he waited for her fever to break.
Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woman's breathing steadied.
Her face softened, and the flush of fever began to recede from her cheeks. The rancher let out a quiet sigh of relief, rasp. She wasn't out of danger yet, but for the first time in hours he allowed himself to believe that she might survive. She stirred again, her eyes fluttering open, and this time her gaze was clear, not clouded by fever. She looked at him, a small, tired smile playing at the corners of her lips. You saved me," she whispered, her voice stronger now. The rancher nodded, though he didn't have the words to explain everything he felt. "We saved each other," he said quietly.
The days that followed were a blur of quiet moments, filled with the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of rain gently tapping against the windows.
The storm outside had finally passed, leaving behind a heavy silence that hung in the air. But the calm inside the cabin was a welcome relief. The woman had survived the worst of it, her fever finally broken, though she still looked fragile. Her strength was slowly returning, but the rancher could see that she wasn't the same as before. The ordeal had changed her. She was no longer the woman who had stumbled into his cabin, desperate and broken. Now she was someone else, someone who had faced the brink of death and somehow made it through. And that resilience, that quiet strength, fascinated him. The rancher had watched over her as she rested, bringing her food and water, checking her wounds and making sure she was comfortable. Every day she grew a little stronger, and every day he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of connection to her. There was something about her will to survive, that had drawn him in. He wasn't sure what it was, but it felt like an unspoken bond between them, one that was formed in the silence of the storm and the quiet struggle for survival. One afternoon, after the worst of the storm had passed and the sun had finally broken through the clouds, the rancher went outside to check on his animals. He had to make sure the fences were intact, that everything was in order. As he walked across the land, his mind kept returning to her. He had never been one for company. He had lived alone for as long as he could remember, choosing the solitude of the open range over the chaos of other people. It was easier that way. Simpler. He didn't have to answer to anyone, didn't have to explain himself. But with her, things were different. There was a softness in his heart that he hadn't felt in years, a pull that he couldn't quite explain.
He kept thinking about what would happen when she was fully recovered.
Breaths. Would she stay? Would she leave? And if she left, what would he do? As he tended to his cattle and checked the fences, he found his mind wandering to places he hadn't expected. He wondered if she would ever tell him her story. She had been so closed off at first, so guarded. She hadn't spoken much about herself, only offering bits and pieces when pressed. But there was a depth to her, something hidden beneath the surface, and he couldn't help but want to know more. When he returned to the cabin, he found her sitting by the fire looking out the window with a faraway expression. She was stronger now, sitting upright with ease, her body no longer trembling from fever. But there was still a sadness in her eyes that hadn't gone away. She seemed lost in thought, her mind somewhere far from the warmth of the fire and the safety of the cabin. "Hey," the rancher said softly as he stepped inside, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," she said, her voice steady but still carrying a hint of exhaustion. "I feel like I've been in a dream."
He nodded, setting his coat down on the chair beside the door.
Breath attention. It was rough few days, he said quietly, taking a seat across from her.
"But you're through the worst of it," her gaze drifting back to the window.
For a moment, the rancher thought she might say nothing at all, but then she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I should be gone by now," she murmured, almost as if to herself. Brass.
"I didn't mean to cause you trouble." The rancher's brow furrowed. "You haven't caused me any trouble," he said firmly. "You needed help, and I gave it."
That's all there is to it. She turned her head to look at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for some kind of answer.
"Why did you help me?" she asked. The question that had lingered between them since the moment she had woken up in the cabin. The rancher felt a lump rise in his throat.
He wasn't sure how to answer that question. Why had he helped her? Rasp. He had asked himself the same thing many times, but the truth was, he didn't know. It wasn't like him to get involved in someone else's problems. especially not in such a dangerous situation. But something about her had drawn him in. Something about her desperation had tugged at his heart. "I didn't have much of a choice," he said finally, his voice rough. "You were out there, alone. I couldn't leave you to die." Her gaze softened, and for a moment she seemed to struggle with something inside herself. Break. She opened her mouth to speak, but then hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "I'm not used to depending on others," she said quietly. "But I've always taken care of myself. Always kept to myself. But when I woke up here, I realized how much I needed someone." The rancher didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to people opening up to him, especially not like this. But he couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy for her, a feeling he hadn't expected. "You don't have to thank me," he said, though he wasn't sure if she was thanking him or herself. "We all need help sometimes." She nodded, her eyes still holding that distant sadness.
I know, she whispered. But it's not just the help.
Narration.
It's the kindness. I didn't expect it.
Breath. I didn't think anyone would help me. The rancher's heart twisted. But he can't come home. Everyone deserves kindness, he said quietly. Even people who don't think they do. They were quiet for a moment, the only sound in the cabin the crackling of the fire. The rancher felt a strange weight in the air, a tension that he couldn't quite explain. He wasn't sure where things were heading between them, but the connection was undeniable. They had both survived the storm together. Both clung to life in the face of adversity. There was something powerful in that, something he couldn't ignore. "What will you do now?" he asked, after a while, breaking the silence. The woman's eyes flickered to the window again, her gaze distant. "I don't know," she said softly. "I don't know where to go."
I never planned to come here. I was just running from something.
"I don't know if I can go back." The rancher nodded, understanding more than she knew. "You don't have to go back if you don't want to," he said. "You're free to stay here for as long as you need." She looked at him then, her expression softening, and for the first time since he had found her, she looked less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared experience that neither of them had asked for, but that had brought them together.
"I don't know what the future holds," she said slowly, her voice almost a whisper.
"But I know I'm not alone anymore. And maybe that's enough." The rancher nodded, his heart swelling with something he hadn't expected. The woman had been a stranger when she first arrived at his cabin, but now she was more than that. She was a part of his life, whether she stayed for a while or left the next morning. He wasn't sure where things would go, but for the first time in a long time he didn't mind the uncertainty. He stood up, walking over to the window. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a sky that was clear and wide, stretching out like an open field. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden light over the land. "It's a beautiful evening," he said, his voice soft. "Maybe we could take a walk tomorrow." "There's a spot by the river I've always liked." The woman looked at him, her eyes bright with something new. "I'd like that," she said, and for the first time the rancher realized that he was looking forward to tomorrow.